Imagine words as this powerful force, you know. Sometimes they're gentle, carrying stories. Other times they're like a storm, shaking things up.
Yeah, and throughout history, that power, especially from certain people, wasn't always welcome. Sometimes it was met with, well, literal iron.
Exactly. Welcome, everyone, to the Deep Dive from the All Sorts podcast. Today, we're looking squarely at a really disturbing example of that kind of suppression, the Scold's Bridle.
And for this dive, we've pulled together quite a bit of material. We're looking at records from places like the Royal Armories, Kelvin Grove Museum, articles from historical sites, and even some online discussions about it.
And our goal, our sort of mission today, is to really understand this thing, the Scold's Bridle. What was it for? How was it used? What does it tell us about how women's speech was viewed way back when?
Yeah, what it reveals about those historical attitudes.
Okay, let's start right there. What exactly was a scold? The word itself sounds so archaic.
It really does. But it was actually a legal term, mostly in late medieval England. It started with the Statutes of Westminster back in 1275.
Right, 1275.
Initially, that law was about slandering the king, but later, maybe late 14th century, it got broader. It started covering people accused of, like, rabble-rousing through troublesome speech.
Rabble-rousing.
But here's the thing. The term scold pretty quickly became almost exclusively pinned on women. Women who were seen as disrupting the peace, you know?
How so? What kind of disruption?
Things like loud quarreling, gossiping, slanderous speech, or brawling. Basically anything that disturbed their neighbors, apparently.
So it wasn't just having a chat. It was seen as actively causing trouble in the community. And mainly women, you said. Were men ever called scolds?
Well, there were terms for men who were seen as troublemakers, like berater or common wrangler.
Berater. Never heard that one.
Yeah, but honestly, the evidence strongly suggests the actual punishment we're talking about, the bridle, was almost entirely reserved for women.
Which brings us to the device itself, the Scold's Bridle. Even the name sounds controlling, like for a horse. What did it actually look like?
That comparison is pretty spot on, actually. It was all about control and silencing. It was basically an iron frame that went around the head.
Okay, like a cage.
Sort of, yeah. And the crucial part was this metal piece, sometimes called a bridle bit or a curb plate, that was forced into the mouth.
Into the mouth. To do what?
To press down hard on the tongue. A sharp metal gag, essentially.
That sounds awful. Not just uncomfortable, but potentially really painful, right?
Absolutely. The main idea was to physically stop them from talking, but it would also cause, you know, horrible discomfort, loads of saliva, muscle fatigue in the mouth, and some versions were even worse. They actually had spikes on the gag part.
Spikes? Why?
To cause severe pain, even cut the inside of the mouth if the person tried to speak or move their tongue too much. It's incredibly brutal when you think about it.
That's just unimaginable cruelty. And I read somewhere that some bridles had other features, too, designed for humiliation.
Oh, definitely. It wasn't just about silence. Some had these grotesque features added, like huge noses, exaggerated ears.
Really? Like a mask?
Kind of, yeah. Sometimes even a bell was attached to draw attention. The whole point was maximum public shame.
A bell so everyone would look.
Exactly. It was a public spectacle, reinforcing what was acceptable behavior for women. And often, the person wearing it was actually led around town on a leash.
On a leash?
Yeah.
Like an animal. The degradation is just staggering. When did this happen? When were these things used? It feels medieval.
You'd think so, but their main period of use was actually much later, primarily from the 16th century right up to the 19th century.
The 1800s? Seriously?
Yep. The first recorded use we know of was in Scotland, 1567. It was mostly used in Scotland and England, and also in their colonies. Though interestingly, it seems to have been less common in the American colonies.
So definitely not ancient history then. What kind of behavior was specific speech would land a woman in one of these?
It was punishment for what they called unacceptable speech, which could mean a lot of things.
Like what?
Things like persistent scolding, hence the name, but also excessive gossiping, nagging, slander, blasphemy, even questioning local authorities.
So speaking truth to power could get you bridled.
Potentially, yes. In Scotland, it was often the church courts, the kirk sessions, or local barony courts that ordered it. In England, it was magistrates, often targeting women seen as rude, maybe women who'd had a drink.
It sounds like a catch-all for any woman who didn't conform or stay quiet.
It does have that feel, doesn't it? And the involvement of church courts really shows how tangled up social control, religion, and the law were.
But was it actually legal? Was the bridle an official punishment?
That's a really important point. In England and Wales, technically, no. The official punishment for being a common scold was the ducking stool.
The ducking stool, where they dunked you in water.
Exactly. That was the legally sanctioned punishment. But despite that, magistrates in England and authorities in Scotland definitely did use the bridles.
So local practice sort of overrode the official law.
It seems that way, especially when dealing with, well, women who are causing trouble in their eyes. And get this, the actual crime of being a common scold stayed on the books in England and Wales until 1967.
1967, that's unbelievable. The crime existed that recently.
It did, though obviously the physical punishments like bridles and ducking stools weren't being used by then, but the legal concept lingered.
Wow. Do we have any specific stories? Accounts of real women who had to endure this? It helps to put a human face on it, you know?
Yes, there are some documented cases. We mentioned the first one, Bessie Taillefer in Edinburgh, 1567.
Right, the one accused of slander about false measures.
That's her. Sentenced to be branket, that's the Scottish term, and then tied or fixed to the town cross for public display.
Terrible. Any others?
There's a well-known case of Dorothy Waugh, a Quaker preacher in Carlisle in 1655.
A preacher. Punished for preaching.
Yes, for preaching in the marketplace. Quakers were often seen as disruptive. She apparently wore the bridle for hours. But interestingly, reports say she actually got a lot of sympathy from the townspeople who saw her.
That is interesting. So maybe not everyone approved of this cruelty.
It suggests some level of public unease, perhaps. We also have records like a farmer in Lichfield in 1789 using iron branks, another name for it, on a neighbor he didn't like. His reason, explicitly to silence her clamorous tongue.
Just because he didn't like her talking.
Seems so. And there's a replica bridle from 1633 kept in a church in Walton-on-Thames. The story goes it was donated because someone was furious about a woman's gossip.
So it persisted for centuries. When was the last time it was actually used?
The last recorded instance seems to be surprisingly late, 1856, in Bolton-le-Moors, Lancashire.
1856. That's well into the Victorian era.
It is. These examples really show how long this practice lasted, even as society was changing in other ways.
Okay, so we know what it was, when it was used, and we have some examples. What were the authorities actually trying to achieve with this? What were the intended effects?
Well, the most obvious goal was silence. Literally stopping the person from speaking.
Right.
But beyond that, it was definitely about public humiliation, making an example of the woman to warn others, especially other women, not to step out of line or speak too freely.
A deterrent, basically.
Exactly. And presumably they hoped the sheer misery of the experience would make the wearer repentant. There's also some suggestion they might have been used in workhouses on female inmates, maybe for offenses other than just scolding.
So potentially a broader tool of control within institutions, too. You mentioned earlier it was almost exclusively for women. Were men never subjected to it?
There are a couple of very rare sort of anecdotal accounts. One mentions a blind beggar in Nottingham, another a man named David Person in Scotland. But these are exceptions that really prove the rule. The overwhelming weight of historical evidence shows this was a punishment aimed squarely at women.
It really drives home that this wasn't just about noise control. It was fundamentally tied into the power dynamics between genders, wasn't it?
Absolutely. The use of the bridle speaks volumes about the unequal roles of men and women, about strict religious ideas about a woman's place, and just this general societal anxiety about women getting out of control.
And it fits alongside those other punishments you mentioned, like the ducking stools and cucking stools.
Precisely. They all share that common thread of public humiliation and controlling women's behavior, particularly their speech. It's also quite disturbing how some older historical writers seem to focus on these kinds of punishments with a sort of, well, one source calls it descriptive relish.
Oh, like they enjoyed describing it. That's creepy.
It is a bit unsettling, yeah. A sort of morbid fascination with instruments of female punishment.
And today, these bridles often end up in museums. We see them behind glass. How should we think about that? How do museums handle displaying something so horrific?
That's a real challenge for museums. They have an ethical duty to show the reality of what these objects were, tools of torture and humiliation, but without being overly sensational or disrespectful to the victims.
Right, you don't want to turn it into some kind of gruesome theme park exhibit.
Exactly. There's a real risk of sanitizing them, making them seem like just curious old objects, and losing the sense of the actual terror and pain they caused. Looking at one in a quiet display case is worlds away from the reality of wearing it while being paraded down a street.
It makes you think about what historical artifacts are really for. Are they just relics? Or should they make us confront uncomfortable truths?
I think ideally they should do both. They're tangible links to the past, yes, but they should also prompt reflection on power, control, cruelty.
And how these things echo through time.
Definitely. Because, as one source we looked at points out, even though the physical device is gone, the idea of policing or silencing women's speech, well, that hasn't entirely disappeared, has it?
No, it really hasn't. It just takes different forms today, maybe more subtle sometimes, but the impulse can still be there.
Exactly. The methods change, but the underlying dynamics might persist.
So, wrapping up this deep dive then, the Scold's Bridle really stands out as this incredibly brutal tool, a symbol of silencing women, of public shaming, used against those whose speech was seen as disruptive.
It clearly reflects those historical power imbalances and the deep-seated anxieties about women expressing themselves, a really stark reminder of how feared a woman's voice could be.
It really is. And thinking about this history forces us, I think, to look around today and ask those ongoing questions. Who gets to speak? Whose voice is valued? Who gets silenced and how?
Those questions remain incredibly relevant. The Iron Bridle might be history, but the dynamics of voice and power are still very much shaping our present.
This has been, well, fascinating, but also deeply disturbing to explore. Thank you for walking us through it.
Thank you. It's important history to confront.
And as we close out this deep dive into, frankly, a very dark corner of history, we here at the All Sorts podcast really want to just emphasize how precious the power of voice is. It's something we should never take for granted.
Hear, hear.
If this exploration resonated with you, if it made you think, we'd be so grateful if you'd lend your voice to support our work. Please consider liking this deep dive, sharing it, and subscribing to the All Sorts podcast right here on YouTube.
Subscribing helps us keep bringing you these kinds of stories, and you'll find a whole library of other deep dives we've done exploring all sorts of fascinating topics.
Absolutely. And the conversation doesn't have to end here. Come and find us, the All Sorts podcast, over on X, Instagram, and Threads. We've got a really great community building there discussing these topics and much more.
We'd love to see you there.
Thank you so much for joining us today for this really important deep dive on the All Sorts podcast.